What would you do if the air itself became poison, not slowly, over decades, but in hours? If breathing, that most fundamental act we never think about, became the thing that killed you? Welcome to this journey into one of the most horrific environmental disasters in modern history. But before we descend into this suffocating darkness, I need you to ask yourself, how many deaths does it take before negligence becomes murder, before profit becomes genocide? Tell us where you're watching from right now, and whether you believe a government can kill thousands of its own citizens through willful ignorance and still call it an accident. Because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about progress, about civilization, and about how easily human life can be deemed acceptable collateral damage. This episode discusses real historical events involving the deaths of thousands of people, including children and the elderly. We present this account with profound respect for those who suffered and died. The details included serve understanding, not sensationalism, but they are disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. In the archives of the British Home Office, there exists a document that took 60 years to declassify, a memo dated December 10, 1950, with a single line that was redacted until 2012. The death toll may exceed initial estimates by a factor of 10. Recommend minimal public disclosure. Not a natural disaster. Not an act of God. A man-made apocalypse that a government watched unfold and chose to minimize rather than acknowledge. We're about to delve into a mystery that killed at least 12,000 people in 5 days, where an entire city suffocated slowly while officials debated whether admitting the scale of catastrophe would be politically inconvenient. This isn't just a story about weather. This is a question about what happens when economic priorities collide with human life, and economics wins. It was the year 1952. King George VI had died that February, and young Queen Elizabeth II sat newly crowned upon the throne of a Britain still rebuilding from war. The empire was shrinking, but British industry was roaring back to life, coal-fired and unstoppable. But in the cold December of that year, the combination of weather, industry, and governmental negligence was about to create something unprecedented. A killer fog that turned the streets of London into a gas chamber and then vanished, leaving behind a death toll so massive that the government spent 60 years trying to hide the truth. But there was something else, something that makes this story even more disturbing than mass death and official cover-ups. Because this wasn't the first time. London had been choking on its own air for centuries. They knew. Everyone knew. They called it pea soup fog. They wrote poems about it. They painted it. They breathed it every winter. And they did nothing. London, in December of 1950, was a city built on burning. Not the burning of war, that had ended 7 years earlier, leaving vast scars across the East End, but the burning of coal. Millions upon millions of tons of it, feeding the insatiable appetite of industry, of progress, of a nation desperate to prove it was still great despite losing an empire. Picture this city, not the London you know from photographs or films, but the London that existed in that liminal space between post-war austerity and modern prosperity. A city where bomb sites still gaped like missing teeth in the urban smile, where families huddled around coal fires because central heating was a luxury most couldn't afford, where factory smokestacks crowned the skyline like a forest of industrial gods, each one breathing darkness into the winter sky. The air had a taste. That's what survivors remember most, not just the smell, though that was overwhelming, a thick mixture of sulfur and soot and something acrid that made your throat close. But the taste, metallic and bitter, coating your tongue, infiltrating your mouth no matter how tightly you pressed your lips together. The taste of progress, the taste of prosperity, the taste of death. London had approximately 8 million residents that December. 8 million people inhaling the byproducts of 300,000 tons of coal burned every week. 8 million people who had grown so accustomed to dirty air that they barely noticed anymore. The white shirts that turned gray by noon. The black mucus they coughed up every morning. The way buildings seemed to age a decade every year under the constant assault of particulates. They called it London particular, the fog, almost affectionate, as if it were a quirky uncle rather than a slow, acting poison. Victorian writers had romanticized it. Dickens had described it in Bleak House as a fog that was everywhere, creeping into the cabooses of collier, brigs, lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging. Arthur Conan Doyle had made it atmospheric, a perfect backdrop for Sherlock Holmes and gaslight mystery. But here's what they didn't romanticize, what the poetry carefully avoided: the death rate. Even in normal winters, respiratory diseases killed thousands in London. Bronchitis, pneumonia, tuberculosis. The city's lungs were already compromised, had been for generations. The Industrial Revolution had built an empire on coal smoke, and Londoners had been breathing the price for over a century. December 5, 1952, began like any cold Friday in London. Temperature around 30, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear skies, unusual for December. People went about their business. The morning commute, the factories opening, the coal deliveries beginning their rounds. Every home, every business, every factory would need fuel for the weekend ahead. It was going to be cold, the forecasters said. Bundle up, keep the fires burning. No one suspected that within 24 hours the city would become uninhabitable. Let me explain what was about to happen, because understanding the mechanism makes it so much worse. It wasn't magic. It wasn't mysterious. It was basic atmospheric science, the kind meteorologists understood perfectly well even in 1950. 2. A high-pressure system had settled over southern England. High pressure means stable air, clear skies, calm winds. Pretty weather, but it also means something else: temperature inversion. Normally, air temperature decreases as you go higher in altitude. Warm air rises, carrying pollutants up and away. It's the atmosphere's natural ventilation system. But during a temperature inversion, a layer of warm air sits on top of cold air, acting like a lid on a pot. The cold air at ground level, heavy and dense, becomes trapped. It can't rise, it can't disperse. It just sits there, accumulating everything humans pump into it. The Thames Valley, where London sits, is essentially a bowl perfect for trapping air. Add a temperature inversion, and you've created a prison for pollution with 8 million people locked inside. The Meteorological Office knew this was happening. They tracked the high-pressure system. They measured the temperature gradient. They understood exactly what conditions were developing. They said nothing. It began on Friday evening, December 5th, as the sun set early, as it always did in December at that latitude, darkness claiming the city by 4 in the afternoon. The temperature dropped rapidly. Every household, responding to the cold in the same way humans had responded for millennia, fed their fires. Coal deliveries accelerated. Factory furnaces burned hotter to maintain production through the cold snap. And the smoke had nowhere to go. Visibility began to decrease around 6 in the evening. Not unusual. Fog was expected in winter. But this fog was different, thicker, yellower. It didn't drift in from the Thames like normal fog. It seemed to materialize out of the air itself, forming at ground level, building upward. By 8 o'clock, Visibility on some streets had dropped to a few feet. By 10 o'clock, it was measured in inches. Margaret Anderson was 20, 3 years old, a nurse at St. Thomas Hospital across from the Houses of Parliament. She had finished her shift at 6 and was walking home to her flat in Kennington, a journey of less than 2 miles that she made 5 nights a week. She knew every street, every corner, every landmark. She never made it home that night. Her roommate reported her missing on Saturday morning. Police found her body on Sunday, 3 blocks from the hospital, less than a quarter mile from where she'd started. She had become disoriented in the fog, walked in circles, and eventually collapsed. The official cause of death was listed as acute bronchitis, but her lungs, when examined, were black. Coal black. In 48 hours, she had inhaled enough particulate matter to turn her respiratory system into something that resembled a miner's lungs after decades underground. She was one of the first. She would not be one of the last. Here's what was in that fog, not water vapor. That was merely the delivery mechanism. No, the fog was carrying sulfur dioxide from coal combustion, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter so fine it could penetrate deep into the alveoli of the lungs. The particles weren't just carrying pollution. They were creating it, acting as catalysts for chemical reactions that produced sulfuric acid in the air itself. People were breathing acid. They were breathing coal dust. They were breathing tar. And they were doing it with every involuntary breath, every moment of every day, unable to escape because the poison was everywhere, in every street, every building, every home. The sulfuric acid formed a coating on the respiratory tract. Each breath became harder than the last. The body tried to expel the foreign matter through coughing, but that only drew more of the poisoned air deeper into the lungs. It was a trap with no exit. By Saturday morning, December 6th, hospitals began to notice an uptick in respiratory admissions. Nothing alarming yet, just more than usual, elderly patients mostly, and some with pre-existing conditions. Doctors prescribed rest, kept them for observation, sent some home with advice to stay indoors, as if indoors was safer. The fog had infiltrated everything. It seeped through window frames and under doors. It filled homes and offices and shops. There was no escape from it, no sanctuary. Opening a door released a visible wave of the stuff, rolling in like something solid, something with substance and weight. Visibility in central London that Saturday was less than 1 foot. 1 foot. People walked with their hands outstretched, feeling for walls, for lamp posts, for anything to orient themselves. Cars crawled at walking speed with someone walking in front, guiding them. Double-decker buses were abandoned in the streets when drivers simply couldn't see to continue. The city was shutting down, but slowly, in denial. Theaters remained open, though performers complained they couldn't see the audience through the haze that filled the auditoriums. Football matches were played in conditions where players couldn't see their teammates 20 feet away. The attitude was quintessentially British: keep calm and carry on. But in hospitals, morgues, and nursing homes, something else was happening. Something that wouldn't become clear for days, and wouldn't be fully acknowledged for decades. People were dying. Not in ones or twos, but by the hundreds, by the thousands. At Finsbury Park, a maternity hospital in North London, the night shift on Saturday, December 6th, was unlike anything the nurses had experienced. Every infant in the ward was struggling to breathe. Tiny chests heaved with the effort of pulling air through lungs clogged with particulates. The sound was everywhere, a symphony of wet, labored breathing punctuated by coughs that brought up black mucus from lungs too small to understand why they were failing. Nurse Patricia Connolly, who was 29 years old and had worked through the Blitz, later testified that she'd seen nothing more terrifying than those hours. During the bombing, she told a parliamentary inquiry years later, "You knew what the threat was. You could see it coming. You could take shelter. But this, the babies were drowning in their own beds, and there was nothing we could do. We had no treatment. We had no cure. We could only watch and try to keep them comfortable while their little bodies fought a battle they were doomed to lose." 17 infants died in that hospital between December 5th and December 9th. 17. Their lungs, when examined, showed damage consistent with prolonged exposure to severe air pollution. But these were newborns. Some had been born just days before the fog arrived. Their entire lives, from first breath to last, had been measured in hours, and all of those hours had been spent breathing poison. The hospital didn't report the cluster of deaths as unusual, because, horrifyingly, they weren't unusual. Infant mortality from respiratory disease was common enough in London that 17 deaths in 5 days, while tragic, didn't trigger alarms. The system was designed to accept a certain baseline of death from air pollution. That's the part that should haunt you. This wasn't an anomaly. This was merely a worse, than normal version of the normal. Here's what makes this story even more disturbing. They knew. The connection between air pollution and death wasn't some mystery waiting to be discovered. It had been documented. It had been studied. It had been ignored. In 1930, a dense fog in the Meuse Valley in Belgium had killed 60 people in 3 days. Industrial pollution, temperature inversion, mass casualties. The mechanism was understood. In 1948, just 4 years before London, a similar event in Donora, Pennsylvania, had killed 20 people and sickened 6,000 out of a population of 14,000. Studies were conducted. Papers were published. The science was clear. The British government had access to these studies. They knew that the combination of heavy coal use, industrial emissions, and weather conditions could create a deadly fog. They knew that London, with its massive population and heavy industrial presence, was particularly vulnerable. And they did nothing. Worse than nothing, they actively opposed regulation. The coal industry was sacred. It employed hundreds of thousands. It powered the nation's recovery. To regulate coal burning, to mandate cleaner fuels or smokeless zones, would be expensive. It would slow industrial growth. It would be, in the parlance of the time, bad for business. So they made a calculation. An unconscious one, perhaps, but a calculation nonetheless. The deaths from air pollution were acceptable losses compared to the economic costs of prevention. The elderly, the ill, the very young, their lives were the price of prosperity. On December 4th, 1952, the day before the fog arrived, a meteorologist named David Brunt warned the Ministry of Health about the developing conditions. His memo was polite but clear. The weather pattern forming over London created conditions identical to those in Donora. Precautions should be taken. Warnings should be issued. The memo was filed. No warnings were issued. No precautions were taken. 24 hours later, the fog began. By Sunday, December 7th, even the most stubborn optimists couldn't deny that something extraordinary was happening. The fog was thicker than anyone had ever seen. So thick that in some areas you couldn't see your hand held at arm's length. The color had deepened from yellow to a dark greenish, brown, like pus or rotten vegetation, and people were dying. Everywhere, Dr. Horace Jules, a physician at Charing Cross Hospital, began to notice the pattern around mid-day Sunday. The emergency ward, which typically saw perhaps a dozen respiratory cases in a weekend, had admitted 67 since Friday evening. 3 had died while waiting to be seen. The morgue, designed to hold 10 bodies, contained 20. 3. It was the speed of it. He later wrote in his memoir. Patients would arrive ambulatory, complaining of shortness of breath and a cough. Within hours, they would be gasping, lips blue, unable to speak. Within a day, they were dead. I've never seen bronchitis progress so rapidly. It was as if their lungs were being eaten away from the inside. What he was seeing was not simply bronchitis. It was acute respiratory distress caused by sulfuric acid, literally dissolving the mucous membranes of the respiratory tract. Patients were drowning in blood and fluid and their own destroyed tissue. The fog wasn't just irritating their lungs, it was destroying them. But here's the thing that would later emerge as perhaps the most damning detail of the entire disaster. The hospitals weren't communicating with each other or with the Ministry of Health. Each hospital was seeing an unprecedented surge in respiratory emergencies and deaths, but no one was aggregating the data. No one was looking at the city-wide pattern, because if they had, they would have seen something unimaginable. The death rate in London had increased by a factor of 10. In normal December weather, London averaged about 200 deaths per day from all causes. By Sunday, December 7th, that number had climbed to over 1,000 per day. By Monday, it would reach 2,000. That's a death rate comparable to a major bombing raid, to an epidemic of plague, to a catastrophic battlefield. But there were no bombs falling, no disease outbreak, just air, just the air they breathed every day, but concentrated, trapped, poisonous. Public transportation had largely ceased. The underground trains still ran the air below ground, while not clean, was at least clearer than the surface. But getting to the stations meant walking through the fog. Buses were abandoned, cars were useless, the city was paralyzed. This meant that people who needed medical help couldn't reach it. Ambulances, even when they could be summoned, couldn't navigate streets where visibility was measured in inches. Families made terrible calculations: risk the journey to the hospital through poisonous air, or stay home and hope the victim could weather it. Many chose to stay home. Many died at home. Robert Thorpe was 68 years old, a retired dock worker with chronic bronchitis, a condition so common among working-class Londoners it was almost expected. He lived with his daughter's family in Bermondsey, in the East End. When the fog came, his condition worsened rapidly. By Sunday, he was struggling to breathe even while sitting still. His daughter, Eleanor, faced an impossible choice. The nearest hospital was 3/4 of a mile away. Her father could barely stand, let alone walk that distance through air that was actively killing him. But staying home meant no medical care, no oxygen, no intervention beyond what she could provide. She chose to stay. She held her father's hand as he suffocated over the course of 18 hours, his breathing becoming shallower, his lips turning blue, his eyes filled with a terror that she would remember for the rest of her life. He died on Monday morning, December 8th, at 6:23. She knew the exact time because she checked his pulse every few minutes during the final hour, praying for a beat, finding none. The death certificate listed cause of death as chronic bronchitis, acute exacerbation. No mention of the fog. No acknowledgement that he had been murdered by air pollution. Just another old man with bad lungs who died of respiratory disease. Acceptable, expected, normal. At 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the same man who had rallied Britain through the Blitz, who had promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but also ultimate victory, sat in meetings discussing the fog. The discussion, according to declassified cabinet minutes, focused not on emergency response or public health intervention, but on messaging. How should the government respond to growing public concern without causing panic? How could they acknowledge the fog without admitting it was a crisis? The word disaster was explicitly forbidden in official communications. Minister of Health Ian MacLeod prepared a statement for Parliament. The first draft included estimates of increased deaths and a call for emergency measures. That draft was rejected. The second draft mentioned unfortunate weather conditions and advised people with respiratory conditions to stay indoors if possible. That was the extent of the official government response. Stay indoors if possible, as if that were simple. As if people didn't need to work, didn't need to buy food, didn't need to live their lives. As if staying indoors protected you when the fog penetrated every building in the city. No emergency broadcast system warning was issued, no public health advisory, no recommendation to close schools or factories. The government's position was that this was severe weather, unfortunate, certainly, but natural, an act of God, not their responsibility. Behind closed doors, they knew better. Meteorological reports clearly indicated that this was not natural fog, but a combination of fog and smoke. Smog, though that word wasn't yet in common use. Reports from hospitals were beginning to filter up through the bureaucratic chain. The numbers were becoming impossible to ignore. But acknowledging those numbers meant acknowledging culpability. It meant admitting that decades of unregulated coal burning, that the prioritization of industry over public health, that the rejection of clean air advocates as alarmist troublemakers, it all meant that the government had, through negligence, created the conditions for mass death. Better to call it weather. Better to say nothing. By Monday, December 8th, the death toll was staggering, though the full scope wouldn't be understood for weeks. Hospitals had run out of beds, then run out of floor space, then run out of oxygen. Morgues were full. Bodies were being stored in hospital corridors, in unused offices, anywhere there was space. The fog remained. Thick, yellow, brown, poisonous. It had now persisted for 3 full days with no signs of abating. The high-pressure system showed no indication of movement. The temperature inversion remained intact. The city was sealed in its own industrial exhalation, choking slowly. And then nature intervened where government would not. On Tuesday, December 9th, the weather pattern shifted. A front moved in from the Atlantic, bringing wind and rain. The temperature inversion broke. The warm air mass that had been holding the pollution close to the ground lifted. The wind began to disperse the accumulated pollution. By Wednesday, December 10th, the fog was gone. Visibility returned to normal. The Thames, which had been invisible from its own bridges, could be seen again. The sun, absent for 5 days, broke through. London breathed, but the dying wasn't finished. What medical researchers would later term the long tail of the disaster was just beginning. Thousands of people had sustained severe lung damage during the 5 days of the fog. Their respiratory systems were compromised, inflamed, scarred. Even breathing clean air was now difficult. In the weeks following December 9th, respiratory deaths continued at elevated rates. People who had survived the fog itself died from complications. Pneumonia, heart failure brought on by oxygen deprivation, infections in damaged lungs. The initial deaths were just the beginning. Dr. H. L. Morrison, a statistician working for the London County Council, began compiling data. What he found was almost beyond belief. Deaths in Greater London during the fog period and its immediate aftermath exceeded 12,000 above the normal rate. 12,000. To put that in context, more British civilians died in 5 days of fog than died in the first 5 months of German bombing during the Blitz. This wasn't war. This was peace. This was progress. This was what civilization looked like when profit outweighed breath. But Morrison's report, when he submitted it to the Ministry of Health in January of 1953, was marked confidential and filed away. The official government position remained that approximately 4,000 excess deaths had occurred, a number that was bad but not catastrophic, unfortunate but within the realm of severe weather events. They were lying, not through ignorance but through choice. The data existed. The bodies existed. The truth was there in hospital records, in morgue logs, in death certificates, if anyone bothered to aggregate them. No one in power wanted to aggregate them. Here's where the story becomes not just tragic, but enraging. Because this wasn't incompetence. This was cover-up. In February of 1953, Parliament held hearings on the fog disaster. Families who had lost loved ones testified. Doctors described the medical emergency. Scientists explained the atmospheric conditions and the industrial contribution. The government response was to minimize, deflect, and delay. They questioned the death toll estimates. They emphasized the unusual weather rather than the pollution. They suggested that many of the dead were elderly or infirm and might have died anyway. As if timing were coincidence. As if 12,000 people just happened to die during the same 5 days that the air became poisonous. Minister of Health Ian MacLeod, when pressed on whether the government had any responsibility, stated, "I cannot accept that anyone is to blame for what was a combination of meteorological and topographical factors beyond human control. Beyond human control, as if humans hadn't filled the air with sulfur and soot. As if the pollution were natural, not industrial. As if choices hadn't been made, for decades, that prioritized coal and profit over human life." But here's what actually happened behind those careful parliamentary words. The government knew that admitting the true scale of the disaster would require them to do something about it. Regulation, clean air laws, restrictions on coal burning, all of which would be expensive and politically difficult. So they did what powerful entities do when faced with their own culpability. They minimized the harm, questioned the evidence, and waited for public attention to move on. And for a while it worked, but some people wouldn't let it rest. Dr. Morrison continued his statistical work, refining his death toll estimates, documenting the patterns of mortality. Dr. Logan, the chief medical statistician for the General Register Office, confirmed Morrison's findings. The death toll was not 4,000, but at least 12,000, possibly higher. Families organized. They formed advocacy groups. They wrote letters to newspapers, to MPs, to anyone who would listen. They demanded a public inquiry, real investigation, accountability. The woman I mentioned earlier, Eleanor, who had watched her father suffocate in his own bed, became one of the most vocal advocates. She testified before parliamentary committees. She spoke to journalists. She described, in agonizing detail, what it was like to watch someone die slowly of poisoning while your government insisted it was just bad weather. They want us to believe it was an accident. She said in one interview published in the Times in 1954, "But you don't accidentally fill the air with poison. You don't accidentally ignore warnings. You don't accidentally prioritize factory profits over human lungs. My father was murdered. 12,000 people were murdered, and our government won't even admit it happened." The newspapers, to their credit, began investigating. The Times published a series of articles in 1954 titled "The Air We Breathe," that detailed the history of air pollution in London, the known health effects, and the government's failure to act. The articles were scathing. They were also largely ignored by policymakers. It took 4 years. 4 years of advocacy, of pressure, of families refusing to let their dead be forgotten. 4 years of medical studies confirming the death toll, of scientific papers explaining the mechanism, of public health officials finally speaking out. In 1956, 4 years after the fog, Parliament finally passed the Clean Air Act. The act was revolutionary for its time. It created smokeless zones in cities where only authorized fuels could be burned. It mandated taller chimneys for factories to disperse emissions. It provided subsidies for homeowners to convert from coal to cleaner heating sources. It was, in effect, an admission that the government had been wrong. That air pollution was not an inevitable byproduct of progress, but a controllable hazard. That human life was worth the economic cost of regulation. But it came 4 years too late for 12,000 people. For Margaret Anderson, the nurse who died walking home from work. For Robert Thorpe, who suffocated in his daughter's arms. For the 17 infants at Finsbury Park who never had a chance. 4 years too late, but the story doesn't end with the Clean Air Act. Because even as the government passed legislation acknowledging that air pollution was a serious public health hazard, they continued to suppress the true death toll from the 1950 disaster. The official government figure remained 4,000 for decades, 50 years. Morrison's research was classified. Logan's statistics were marked confidential. The real numbers were buried in archives that required special permission to access. Why? Because 12,000 deaths was a Holocaust. 12,000 deaths made the government complicit in mass casualty. 12,000 deaths required accountability, apologies, possibly even reparations to families. 4,000 deaths could be called unfortunate. 12,000 was unforgivable. It wasn't until 2002, 50 years after the disaster, that researchers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine gained full access to the mortality records. Their analysis, published in Environmental Health Perspectives, confirmed what Morrison had calculated 50 years earlier. At least 12,000 excess deaths during and immediately after the fog, with long-term health impacts affecting hundreds of thousands more. Even then, even with the evidence finally public, the British government never issued a formal apology, never acknowledged the cover-up, never admitted that they had spent 50 years minimizing a disaster that killed more civilians than many military battles. The victims remain officially unacknowledged. There is no memorial, no monument, no national day of remembrance. I hosted again. The 1950 London fog disaster became a turning point in environmental health research, even though its full scale remained hidden. Scientists who had suspected the deadly impacts of air pollution finally had undeniable proof. Research in the following decades established clear causal links between air pollution and mortality. The term smog entered common usage. Cities around the world, particularly in the United States, began implementing clean air regulations, often citing London as a cautionary tale. But here's the bitter irony. The disaster was most influential outside Britain. American cities like Los Angeles and New York passed air quality laws in the 1960s that were more stringent than London's. Japan's catastrophic pollution events in the 1960s led to environmental regulations that specifically referenced the London fog as evidence that inaction cost lives. The British government, meanwhile, continued to resist aggressive regulation. The Clean Air Act of 1956 was groundbreaking but had limited enforcement. Industries lobbied for exceptions, delays, exemptions. Coal remained the primary fuel source for decades longer than necessary. Progress came slowly, reluctantly, as if each regulation required its own miniature disaster to justify it. In the years following the disaster, journalists and researchers interviewed survivors. Their testimonies paint a picture more vivid and more horrifying than any statistic. James Weatherby, who was 12 years old in December of 1952, remembered walking to school on Monday, December 8th. I couldn't see the street at all. My mum tied a scarf around my face, covering my nose and mouth, but it didn't help. The fog soaked through. With every breath, I could taste coal, bitter and chemical. My throat burned. My friend Tommy collapsed halfway there. We left him sitting against a wall, said we'd get help. When we came back an hour later, he was dead. Just sitting there, eyes closed, like he'd fallen asleep. He was 11. Dorothy Pierce worked as a telephone operator at an exchange in central London. The fog came into the building even though we kept the doors and windows shut. You could see it in the air, swirling. Under the lights, we wore cloth masks, but they turned black within an hour. Black, not gray. We'd cough up this awful stuff, and it would be pure black. Like we'd been eating coal. Some of the girls got so sick they couldn't work, but management wouldn't send us home. They said the city needed the telephone lines operational. One girl died at her station, just slumped forward onto her keyboard. They carried her out and put someone else in her chair. These weren't traumatic memories embellished by time. When researchers cross-referenced testimonies with medical records, death certificates, and news reports, the accounts were accurate. People did die at work. Children did die walking to school. The fog did infiltrate every building, every home, every breath. The long-term health impacts of the fog were devastating and lifelong. Children who breathed the poisoned air developed chronic respiratory conditions that persisted into adulthood. Asthma rates among those who were young children in December 1950, remained elevated throughout their lives. A study published in 2009 tracked 4,000 individuals who had been children in London during the fog. Their life expectancy was reduced by an average of 2 years compared to people born just a year later or living just outside the affected area. Their rates of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, heart disease, and lung cancer were all significantly elevated. 5 days of breathing poisoned air had stolen decades of life. The question that haunts this disaster is simple: how many deaths are acceptable? Because air pollution didn't end with the Clean Air Act. It changed form, became less visible, but continued to kill. Diesel exhaust, industrial emissions, particulate matter from 1,000 sources. The air in cities remains compromised, and people continue to die from respiratory disease at rates well above what they would be with clean air. The World Health Organization estimates that 7 million people die annually from air pollution worldwide. 7 million every single year. The London fog, even at its newly acknowledged toll of 12,000, was 5 days. Air pollution now kills the equivalent of 400 London fog disasters every year. We know this. The science is clear. The mechanism is understood. The solutions exist. And yet, globally, we continue to prioritize industry and profit over breath. We continue to accept a baseline rate of death from air pollution as normal, as inevitable, as just the cost of modern life. The London fog should have been a wake-up call that reverberated through history. Instead, it became a footnote that most people don't even know about. Even today, even with all the evidence finally public, there are those who minimize the disaster. You can find articles claiming the death toll was exaggerated, that many of the dead were elderly or ill and would have died anyway, that the fog was a natural event that humans couldn't have prevented. This denial follows a pattern familiar to anyone who studies environmental health. Deny the harm exists, then question the scale of harm, then argue that the harm is inevitable, then insist that preventing harm would be too expensive. It's the same playbook used for tobacco, for lead, for asbestos, for climate change. And it works because it's easier to accept a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth. The uncomfortable truth is this: the London fog disaster was not a natural event. It was the logical conclusion of decades of choices to prioritize industry over health, profit over safety, economic growth over human life. In 2012, 60 years after the disaster, the British government quietly declassified documents that had been sealed since 1952. Among them was a memo from the Ministry of Health dated December 7, 1950, in the middle of the fog itself. The memo, written by a civil servant whose name has been redacted, reads in part, "Preliminary hospital reports indicate deaths from respiratory causes have increased dramatically since Friday evening. Current estimates suggest fatalities may reach several thousand if conditions persist. Recommend immediate emergency broadcast warning population to avoid outdoor activity and advising evacuation of vulnerable populations. Also recommend investigation into temporarily shutting down major industrial sources of emissions." In the margin, handwritten in what has been identified as Minister Ian MacLeod's handwriting, is a single word: no. Below that, economic impact unacceptable, monitor situation. They knew. On the second day of the disaster, they knew people were dying in huge numbers. They knew the pollution was the cause. They knew that shutting down factories and issuing evacuation warnings might save thousands of lives. And they chose not to act. That memo, more than any statistic, more than any death toll, reveals the truth. The London fog disaster wasn't a failure of knowledge. It was a failure of will, a failure of morality, a choice to let people die rather than disrupt industry. When those documents became public in 2012, there was a brief flurry of media attention. A few newspaper articles, some television documentaries, calls for an official inquiry, an apology, a memorial. The government response was a brief statement expressing regret for the tragedy and acknowledging that mistakes were made in the handling of the disaster. No apology, no acceptance of responsibility, no acknowledgement that those mistakes had been deliberate choices to prioritize industry over life. The families of victims, the few who were still alive 60 years later, received nothing, no compensation, no formal recognition, just that mealy-mouthed statement about mistakes. Eleanor, the woman whose father died in her arms, lived until 2014. She was 91. In one of her last interviews, she said, "I waited 2 years for them to admit what they did. And when they finally did, they still couldn't say they were sorry. They couldn't acknowledge that my father's death was murder, that 12,000 murders took place while they watched and chose to do nothing." She died before seeing any memorial erected, before any official apology, before any real accountability. She died waiting for justice that never came. Here's what haunts me most about this story. The fog itself is gone, has been for 70 years, but the mindset that created it persists. We still make the same calculations. We still accept baseline rates of death from environmental hazards as inevitable rather than criminal. We still prioritize short-term economic concerns over long-term human welfare. The air in London today is dramatically cleaner than it was in 1952. The Clean Air Act worked. Regulations work. When we choose to value breath over profit, people live. But globally, we continue to tolerate air pollution that kills millions annually. We continue to resist regulation as too expensive or bad for business. We continue to treat human life as an acceptable cost of economic growth. The fog was visible. You could see it, taste it, feel it coating your lungs. Modern air pollution is often invisible, which makes it easier to ignore, easier to deny, easier to accept. But invisible doesn't mean harmless. The mechanism hasn't changed. Particulates still lodge in lungs. Sulfur dioxide still burns respiratory tissue. Heart disease and lung cancer still result from prolonged exposure. The fog that killed 12,000 people in 5 days was just a concentrated version of what we breathe every day in varying degrees. The difference is one of magnitude, not kind. So let me ask you the question that this disaster poses, the question that authorities in 1950 refused to answer honestly. How many deaths are acceptable? If saving lives requires economic disruption, reduced industrial output, costly regulations, what's the exchange rate? How many human deaths equal 1 percentage point of GDP growth? What's the formula? Because make no mistake, that formula exists. It's used every day by governments and corporations making decisions about environmental regulations, safety standards, pollution controls. They don't state it explicitly, but it's there in every cost, benefit analysis, every delayed regulation, every loosened restriction. The London fog disaster asked Britain to calculate that exchange rate explicitly. The government chose industry, chose profit, chose to let 12,000 people suffocate rather than interrupt the coal-powered machinery of prosperity. And the terrifying reality is that we continue to make the same choice, just less obviously, spread out over time rather than concentrated into 5 horrifying days. Today, if you visit London, there are no markers of the disaster, no plaques commemorating the dead, no museum exhibit explaining what happened. The history has been paved over, literally and figuratively. But the fog itself has entered London folklore. On cold December nights, when a light mist rolls in from the Thames, elderly residents will sometimes pause and remember. The smell of coal smoke, rare now, but not entirely absent, triggers memories for those old enough to have lived through it. There are stories, probably apocryphal but persistent, of a particular shade of yellow, brown fog that occasionally appears in isolated pockets of the city. People report an acrid taste, a burning throat, a sense of suffocating dread. Scientists explain it as particulate matter from construction sites, or diesel exhaust trapped by temperature conditions, or simply psychological projection. But some residents swear it's the fog returning, or rather, they say, it never really left. It just spread out, became diluted, invisible but still present. Still killing, just slowly enough that we can pretend it's not happening. Whether that's meteorologically accurate doesn't really matter. The metaphor is perfect. In 2019, a researcher at King's College London named Dr. Sarah Mitchell tracked down what she believed to be one of the last living survivors who had been an adult during the fog. His name was Arthur Bennett, and he was 94 years old. In an interview conducted in his care home in Southwark, he described working at Battersea Power Station during the fog, one of the very sources of pollution that had created the disaster. "We didn't stop," he said. "Not for 1 minute. The supervisors said the city needed power, especially with transport shut down. People needed lights, heat, so we kept shoveling coal, kept the furnaces burning. I remember looking out through the window. You couldn't see anything, just yellow darkness, and I remember thinking, we're making this. This is us." He paused for a long time before continuing. "I breathed that fog for 5 days. 45 years later, they told me I had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Doctor said it was from smoking, from age, but I knew. I'd been breathing coal dust and ash since I was 14 years old, working at that power station. The fog was just the concentrated version of what I'd been breathing my whole life. He died 6 months after that interview, at 94, of respiratory failure. His death certificate made no mention of the 1952 fog. Why would it? He died 7 years later. The connection was invisible, unproven, impossible to quantify. Just like the deaths of millions of others whose lungs were compromised by decades of air pollution, whose lives were shortened by years of breathing poison, whose heart disease and cancer can't be definitively traced to any single source of contamination. The fog killed 12,000 people in 5 days. But it also killed Arthur Bennett, slowly, over 67 years. And it killed thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more, who don't appear in the statistics because their deaths came too late to be counted. Here's what we know now that we didn't know in 1952. Actually, that's wrong. Here's what we know now that they knew in 1952, but chose to ignore. Air pollution kills. Not might kill, not probably kills. Kills, with certainty, with predictability. The mechanism is understood. The death toll is measurable. The solution is available. We know that reducing air pollution saves lives immediately and dramatically. The Clean Air Act's effects were visible within years. Respiratory disease rates dropped. Life expectancy increased. Infant mortality fell. We know that the economic cost of regulation is vastly lower than the economic cost of treating pollution, related illness, and premature death. Every pound spent on clean air regulations returns multiple pounds in reduced healthcare costs and increased productivity. We know all of this, and yet, globally, we continue to tolerate levels of air pollution that kill millions annually. Why? Because the deaths are distributed, because they're often delayed, because they happen to individuals we don't see rather than crowds we can't ignore, because it's easier to accept a constant background rate of death than to confront a spectacular disaster. The fog was spectacular. 12,000 deaths in 5 days couldn't be ignored or minimized, though the government tried. But 7 million deaths spread across a year, across the globe, that we can ignore, that we can minimize, that we can accept as the price of modernity. The London fog should have taught us that there is no acceptable level of poison in our air. Instead, it taught us that if we spread the poison thinly enough, dilute the death toll over time and space enough, we can convince ourselves it's not really happening. Picture this: 1952, December 10th, Wednesday morning, the fog has lifted. The sun breaks through for the first time in 5 days. Londoners emerge from their homes, blinking in the unaccustomed brightness. The air, while not clean, this is still industrial London, is clear. You can see across the street. You can see the sky. People smile. They breathe deeply, grateful to fill their lungs without pain. They tell each other, well, that's over. Nasty bit of weather, that. And in hospitals and morgues across the city, bodies are being tagged and stored. 12,000 of them, though that number won't be acknowledged for 60 years. 12,000 people who woke up on December 5th, expecting a normal Friday, and who never saw another sunrise. The fog has lifted from the air, but it never lifted from the story. It never lifted from the truth. Because admitting what the fog was not a natural disaster but a man-made massacre, not an accident but a predictable consequence of choices made over decades, would require admitting something more uncomfortable, that we value profit more than breath, that we measure human life in pounds and pence, that when forced to choose between industry and mortality, we choose industry and accept the deaths as collateral damage. The fog was just honest about it. For 5 days, the choice was visible, unavoidable, undeniable. Breathe or don't. Live or die. And 12,000 people learned that their government had already made the choice for them. To this day, aspects of the disaster remain unexplained or disputed. Why did the government delay acknowledging the scale for 60 years? The documents are now public, but the motives remain murky. Was it political embarrassment, fear of liability, a genuine belief that admitting the truth would serve no purpose? How many people actually died? The official estimate is 12,000 excess deaths during and immediately after the fog. But long-term health impacts almost certainly killed tens of thousands more over the following decades. Do we count those deaths? Should we? Could it happen again? London's air is cleaner now, and warning systems exist that didn't in 1950, too. But during the London riots of 2011, pollution levels spiked dramatically. During the COVID-19 pandemic, lockdowns reduced air pollution so much that respiratory deaths dropped noticeably. The infrastructure for disaster still exists. We've just made it less likely to all happen at once. And the question that haunts me most: how many people are dying right now today from air pollution that we accept as normal? How many Arthur Bennetts are breathing poison that will kill them slowly, invisibly, in ways that won't appear in statistics or demand accountability? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is the punishment we deserve for continuing to choose profit over breath. The story of the London fog remains one of the most disturbing disasters in modern history, not because of the death toll, though that's staggering, but because of what it reveals about how we value human life. 12,000 people died in 5 days. The government knew it was happening. They knew the cause. They knew that intervention could save lives, and they chose not to intervene because disrupting industry seemed more costly than 12,000 deaths. But questions remain, questions that disturb our sleep if we let them. How many warnings must we ignore before negligence becomes murder? How many people must die before economic inconvenience becomes unconscionable? How do we calculate the value of breath against the value of profit? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is the punishment we deserve for forgetting that every breath is a gift that can be poisoned, every life a calculation that can be made. To this day, December in London carries a weight when fog rolls in, and it still does, though nothing like 1950. 2. Elderly residents remember. They pause. They check the air quality warnings that now exist. They remember when fog meant death. The archives keep growing. Researchers continue finding documents, diaries, photographs. Each discovery adds detail to a disaster we're still trying to understand 70 years later. And on cold December nights, when mist drifts up from the Thames, when the air tastes of coal smoke from someone's fireplace, when visibility drops and the city seems to hold its breath, some people swear they can still feel it, the fog that killed, the fog that revealed what we're willing to accept, the fog that showed us exactly how much human life is worth when measured against industry and profit, and the comfortable lie that tells us this is just the price of progress. Most dismiss it as memory, as imagination, as the mind's tendency to find patterns in randomness, but some know better. If this journey through the deadliest fog in history resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight thinking about how thin the line is between civilization and calculation, between weather and murder, between accepting deaths and preventing them, then this channel has more uncomfortable truths waiting in the darkness. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the questions that history tries to bury. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question how we value human life against economic convenience, how we accept baselines of death as normal, how easily we can watch people suffocate and call it inevitable. And in the comments, I want to know, what's your exchange rate? If regulating air pollution would cost jobs, reduce profits, disrupt industry, how many deaths justify that cost? 1, 100, 12,000, or is there no number of deaths that justifies poisoning the air we breathe? Would you have been the civil servant who wrote no in the margin and chose industry over evacuation? Would you have been the advocate who spent decades demanding truth? Or would you have been, like most of us, someone who breathed the fog, survived it, and then spent the rest of your life trying not to think too hard about what it meant? Until next time, remember, the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to see ourselves clearly. And sometimes that clarity is the darkness we're really afraid of, because the fog lifted 70 years ago, but the choice it represents never has.